In their tomb inscriptions, both Cyrus's son-in-law Darius and his grandson Xerxes, like all other Achaemenid kings of Persia, referred to themselves as Aryans. The word Aryan meant noble. It's from the word Aryan that the country of Iran gets its name.
The country name Iran derives from a very ancient term from Proto-Indo-European times, Arya, which probably meant something like the noble ones. That was a quality that they wanted to associate themselves with. As such, they retained this as the name of their own lands, so that Iran means literally land of the noble ones, land of the Aryans. And Ireland, in fact, Ireland means exactly the same thing. They're etymologically the same word.
The word Arya for the Achaemenid kings of Persia referred to a noble code of conduct.
When we're looking at the Achaemenid period, we can certainly say that Darius, as a self-identified Arya, has a very specific code of conduct, and it relates to the idea of implementing a just rule based on a moral imperative.
But the king wasn't the only one who had to follow a specific code of conduct. Every sector of society had its own code of conduct. It was a system the Persians had inherited from their Iranian ancestors.
In terms of Iranian, what we know, of course, it's the code, the general code for the common person, and then more stricter codes for the more organized people, not only for the warriors, not only for the nobility, but also for the merchants, that is for, and these particular middle class, so to speak, groups, they have the most interesting codes.
These codes of conduct were designed specifically for an illiterate society. Illiterate Iranians were bound to their codes of conduct by nothing more than an oral contract between them and society. Oral contracts were taken far more seriously in illiterate communities than in societies that could keep written records.
There's no such thing as a central government. There's no police force. The only way that social stability is maintained is through kinds of mutually agreed upon codes and norms. And one result of this, that in these kinds of societies we see usually a very strong emphasis on the importance of oral pacts, the power of the word. These are seen as binding, and this is a way that stability and order are maintained within the society.
These oral contracts were sealed with an oath sworn to the pagan god of justice, Mithra.
The god of contracts, Mitra, was seen as the enforcer of oaths, and that if you violated an oath, that you would have to reckon with Mitra, who was going to punish you through some kind of ordeal.
Mithra's punishment ensured that Iranians followed their codes of conduct better than any written document. It was the code of conduct of these Iranian Mithras that would later become chivalry in the West and what's called Javanmardi in the East. Western civilization was founded on Judeo-Christian values. It's an assertion we hear repeated over and over again in the West. But is it true? Modern Western civilization is said to begin with the fall of the Roman Empire. The fall of the Roman Empire coincides with the death of its last emperor, Theodosius I, in 395 AD. But Christianity didn't take over Western Europe until the consecration of St. Augustine in 597 AD. So who ruled Western Europe during those first 202 years after the fall of the Roman Empire?
After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the main people who were left were the Alans in Gaul. You have Goths, you have the Iazyges all over the Ribble Valley in Britain.
Both the Iazyges and the Alans were Iranian peoples. They were two branches of a much larger Iranian tribe known as the Sarmatians. In fact, the name Iazyg comes from the Iranian word yazug, which, according to world-renowned linguist Martin Schwartz, comes from the old Iranian word yazuka, which means youthfully vigorous.
We know that one group of Sarmatians, the Iazygians, had been sent to man Hadrian's Wall in the north of England by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
These Sarmatian Iazyges arrived in Britain in 175 AD, over 2 centuries before the fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, the Iazyges had been brought to northern Britain by the Romans to serve in their cavalry because Iazyges, like all Iranians, were famous for their horseback riding skills.
That's where the 8,000 cavalry were acquired by the Romans, and 5,500 of them were sent to Britain.
5,500 Iazyges were sent to Britain, but by the time the Roman Empire came to an end, their numbers had multiplied.
So we know that at one point in northern England, in the Ribble Valley, there were something like 70,000 Iranian warriors settled as farmers. Over the centuries, they would have become very much part of the British bloodline.
We've got a lot of DNA material from Scotland and from North Wales and Carlisle area, which is in between, that shows the genome for the Caucasus Mountains. And I think the Sarmatians brought those in.
But the Iazyges were not the only Iranians that came to Western Europe. Just after the fall of the Roman Empire, in 406 AD, another group of Iranian Sarmatians, known as the Alans, poured out of the steppes north of the Black Sea and into France, which was then known as Gaul.
406, the Danube froze over and would take the weight of a horse. And so they rode across it and invaded Gaul that way.
The Alans, just like the Persians, called themselves Aryans. In fact, the name Alan was originally Aran, which meant Aryan.
Alan derives from the word Aryan because there's an RL shift in the language.
By 415 AD, these Alans controlled almost all of Gaul, or today's France.
In Gaul, you have the northern parts, Armorica and the area around Paris and Normandy, settled by the ones that come in from the north. And in southern Gaul, you have the Alans that sacked Rome with Alaric come over and settle in the south. So you've got a whole lot of Alans there.
With them, from the steppes of Eurasia, the Alans also brought their ancestral myths.
They brought with them not only their language, but their stories. And in their stories, you have heroes.
The hero of the Alans was a great warrior named Lancelot. In fact, the name Lancelot was originally the Alan of Lot.
My hypothesis is that the name Lancelot originally was the Alan of Lot. So that group was probably where the legends of Lancelot came from. And there was another group up north, led by Goar, who carried some of the legends of Lancelot. And there's another group over in Normandy that carries legends of Lancelot. So Lancelot definitely comes from the continent, and he's definitely from the Alan stories.
But the Alan invasion of Europe did not stop with France. They continued south and took over much of Spain.
The Alans were all over Spain. A bunch of them settled up in the northwest of Spain in particular.
Even northern Italy, especially the region of Ravenna, was settled by Iranian Alans.
The very common Christian name Alan comes from that as well. And hundreds of cities and towns in France, Spain, and northern Italy, Chalon, for instance, comes from that.
Whatever parts of Europe not ruled by Iranian Sarmatians was ruled by the Goths. The Goths were a Germanic people, but they too had adopted Iranian culture.
And the reason that the Goths are important is because all those things that they had learnt from Iranian peoples that they brought to Western Europe contributed to the Gothic culture of Europe.
The Goths had picked up Iranian culture while living next to the Sarmatians on the steppes of Eurasia. The Goths had left their original homeland in Sweden and arrived on the steppes around 150 AD. But the entire steppe west of Mongolia was ruled by Iranian peoples.
The whole steppe, yeah.
Sorry.
The whole steppe.
That great grass highway, that steppe that runs right across the old world, was from earliest times until the arrival of the Turks and the Mongols under the ownership of Iranian peoples.
The only way the Goths could survive on the steppes was to adopt Iranian culture.
Given that they were looking for a home and given that they had to survive somewhere, they realized that their only way to compete with the Iranians was to take up Iranian ways. And they took up Iranian ways with a vengeance. They took up riding horses. There's no evidence that the Goths had ridden horses when they were up there in Scandinavia. They learned that from the Iranian peoples. They took up their methods of warfare. They took up their methods of economics. And it is quite clear from later evidence that they were very strongly influenced by religion.
Most of Western Europe was now ruled by one Iranian culture or another. Of all the Iranian cultures in Europe, none had a greater influence on Western civilization than the Iazyges of northern Britain. In fact, much of what is considered today medieval or Gothic culture was introduced by the Sarmatian Iazyges.
Marcus Aurelius fought a war against the Sarmatians, and what he was fighting against looked like medieval knights. They had chainmail, they fought with lances, they had swords and shields. The shields had images on them that were called tamgas, and the horses were armored. They flew a dragon head banner. They're jousting, they're doing archery. So all this stuff looks like the medieval knights that you see in the Arthurian legends.
The Iazyges, like all Iranian tribes, transmitted their values and principles through myth. These myths were recited as poetry or hymns because the rhyme and rhythm of a poem protected the story from being changed. This form of storytelling is known as the oral tradition.
Oral tradition, of course, is very important. The question is, how is it preserved? And of course, it's easier to memorize, the rhythm. So poetry, which is always rhythm and meter usually, is fascinating and must play a role in these local traditions.
The poems and hymns sung by the Iazyges of northern Britain were about their own hero, King Arthur. King Arthur, the founding hero of Western civilization, had long been considered a Celtic myth. But in their groundbreaking book, titled From Scythia to Camelot, Professor Scott Littleton and Dr. Linda Malcor document step by step how King Arthur shares the same origin as the Alsatian Nartsagas.
Why we think King Arthur began over in Scythia and with the Sarmatians are these parallels to the Nartsagas.
The Nartsagas are the ancestral myths of a people living in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia known as Alsatians. These Alsatians, or Ossietes, just happen to be the last surviving descendants of the Sarmatian people.
The modern Ossetes, which they form an autonomous republic within modern-day Russia, they live in north of the Caucasian Mountains, and they have been there since time immemorial. They're the descendants of Alans and Sarmatians and Scythians. So they provide the last remaining link between Indo-Europeans of the East, that is Persians, and Indo-Europeans of the West, which are Europeans.
The Nartsagas of the Ossetians has a hero named Batras or Batraj, whose story is almost identical to King Arthur's.
Nobody had a good explanation for why there were so many parallels between the two groups, especially the death of Arthur and how it matches the death of Batraj.
There are even some Iranian names found in the King Arthur sagas.
You have names that show up in Iranian languages, and one of them is Lancelot's father, King Ban. That means leader, and we know that because one of the kings that Marcus Aurelius made a treaty with was Banadashpus, horse leader. And Goar is one of the names that shows up in Iranian texts. You have Gor. And K could be linked to Khosrow.
But proving that King Arthur was originally an Iranian hero was not received kindly by some in the West, especially in Britain and the United States.
The Brits and the Americans, what we think happened is they don't want to lose their hold on King Arthur. It's their national tale, and it got tied up in this whole Celtic movement where people are thinking of themselves as Celts and new Druids and stuff like this. Like they've maintained this religion all along, and they haven't. It was all made up at the end of the 19th century. And so us coming out with saying these stories really go back to an Indo-Iranian speaking people was not a popular thing in the English speaking world.
Perhaps the most convincing evidence that King Arthur was an Iranian story is his name. The name Arthur comes from Lucius Artorius Castus, the Roman commander who happened to be the leader of the Iazygian cavalry of northern Britain.
King Arthur likely started out as a Roman soldier called Lucius Artorius Castus, and he's the one that took them from the steppes all the way over to Britain and somehow managed to figure out how to get 5,500 Sarmatians, their wives, their kids, all the food to feed them. He somehow figured how to get it across the English Channel and then get them all the way up to Ribchester.
But the historical accuracy of King Arthur ends with his name. Virtually everything else about King Arthur is a myth, and the myth was Iranian.
Let's leave the historic character aside. Let's ask, where did the stories come from? And the stories, which are all medieval in origin, arise out of a time and a place when the Iranian influence is clearly very strong.
The Sarmatian Iazyges had simply replaced the name of their own Iranian hero with the name of their beloved Roman commander, Artorius Castus.
You've not only got history in there, you've got folktale in there. And that's because of the Sarmatians. And they got the stories of Castus and probably replaced their heroes with his name.
It was through King Arthur that the values of the Iazyges would spread throughout the rest of Europe. It began when the Saxons invaded England and forced the Iazyges to move. Around 500 AD, the Iazyges crossed the English Channel into France, taking their King Arthur with them. But France, or Gaul as it was called, already had its own heroic tradition.
They tried holding back the Saxons, just too many of them. So they crossed the channel between Brittany and Cornwall, and there was a group of Alans settled there. So you have a lot of oral tradition there from the Alans. And the two traditions meet and kind of scramble together.
The two traditions that scrambled together were Lancelot of the Alans and King Arthur of the Iazyges. Since both the Iazyges and Alans were Sarmatians, their heroes were very similar.
They're sharing the same wife. They're ruling the same kingdom. They're doing all this. There was a sense that somehow these figures belong together. And Lancelot does not have a death scene. And it's probably because Arthur had the same death scene. They used it for Arthur, and you couldn't turn around and use it for Lancelot.
But King Arthur had something that Lancelot did not. A code of conduct called chivalry.
The association of Arthur with chivalry probably does emanate from Britain. Lancelot is not a great model of chivalry. He's focusing on Guinevere, which isn't exactly being loyal to King Arthur. And you see that same stuff with the Allans, where they could have a contract with you, and in the middle of battle, if they think the other guy's winning and is going to get more loot, they would switch sides and fight against you.
But the Iazyges of northern Britain were loyal. In fact, the Iazyges took on the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and fought him to the death, which is how they ended up in northern Britain to begin with.
Marcus Aurelius conquered this Sarmatian people called the Iazygians, and he originally intended to just kill them all of those captured. But then he thought, right, send them out to the most distant province, the wildest, the coldest, the most unpleasant place in the whole of his empire, which was northern Britain.
We know that chivalry was introduced by the Iazyges because it was named after them. The name chivalry comes from the Roman word for cavalry, caballerius. In other words, chivalry means cavalry behavior, and the only tribe that served in the Roman cavalry of northern Britain were the Sarmatian Iazyges.
They were remnants of the Sarmatian cavalry in Rome, because there are all these battles that are fought that you need the mobility of cavalry to do it.
No one personifies the chivalry of these Iazygian cavalrymen better than their hero, King Arthur.
King Arthur is the preeminent symbol of chivalry in the Western world. Arthur has really been looked up to over the centuries. It goes way back in the literature.
King Arthur became so popular that even the Allans replaced their own hero, Lancelot, with King Arthur and his code of chivalry.
Everybody was kind of looking up to him in the Middle Ages, trying to be like him. Normans and others wanted to have him in their genealogy, so you get these false genealogies of Arthur that are included in the Kings of Britain. Queen Elizabeth II traces her genealogy back to Arthur.
The tradition of Lancelot may have died out, but the Allans of France found representation in the King Arthur tradition when their hero Lancelot was added as King Arthur's most powerful knight.
Lancelot's considered the preeminent knight because he can take out anyone.
So popular was King Arthur among the Allans that his story spread all the way to the Allans of Spain, including the region of Catalan, which means settlement of the Allans. Catalan, or Catalonia, also happens to be the home of Miguel de Cervantes, the 17th century author who literally wrote the book on Spanish chivalry titled Don Quixote.
Cervantes did live in Catalonia, which means a place settled by Allans.
Even the German Goths found representation in the King Arthur tradition through another knight named Tristan.
The Germans just absolutely adored Tristan. And because Tristan was in Germany, King Arthur came over to Germany because he was Tristan's overlord. It transmits easily because it's one Indo-European culture going to another Indo-European culture. But Arthur really appealed to the German sense of honor, and he reminded them of their own heroes.
But few people were better represented in King Arthur's court than the Celts. The Celts found representation not only through their knight Gawain, but also through Arthur's most trusted advisor, Merlin. Much of Western Europe was united under King Arthur long before Christianity.
King Arthur is a fascinating character because of the provenance of the legend. Here we have a point of transmission of Iranian ideas, Iranian dualism, Iranian religious beliefs into Europe.
King Arthur's ideas and beliefs were Iranian because they were Mithraic in origin. His code of chivalry carries the signature trademark of Mithra. King Arthur became so popular because he was a warrior for justice. Whenever war and justice combine together, there's usually a Mithraic connection behind it. That's because Mithra was a god of justice before he became a god of war.
Their ethics are chivalry. In the Iranian context, their ethics are the pursuit of justice at basically whatever cost. That's where Mithra comes in, right? Because Mithra fights on the side of justice.
Mithra uses war and justice to achieve only one objective, to ensure the victory of Arta. In one of the earliest hymns to Mithra, Mithra goes to war in a war chariot on behalf of Arta. But what was Arta? Arta, or Vedic Urta, had several meanings, but simply put, in the eternal battle between good versus evil, Arta was the original good. In fact, Arta means rightness.
Some like to translate that word, which we have in the Veda as Rita and in Iranian as Arta, as truth. Other people like to stress the idea of order. I like to speak of rightness. So I translate that word as rightness, and from that you get the idea of a righteous person in Iran.
Using military might on behalf of rightness is also the core principle of European chivalry. But what exactly is right? Right was once whatever the person with the most military might said it was. It's where we get the expression, might makes right. But only in Mithraism is military might used on behalf of rightness. Might for right is also the key principle of Western chivalry, as King Arthur tells us in the movie Camelot.
Right or wrong, they have the might. So right or wrong, they're always right.
There was an idea that warriors, if you were mighty, then you were in the right. And the Tales of King Arthur switch that around and make it so it's might for right. You're defending the weak and the poor.
Might for right. Might for right. Might for right. That's it, Jenny. Might. No, not might is right. Might for right.
But the first factual account of military might being used for right was when Cyrus freed the slaves of Babylon after conquering it in 539 BCE. Here's how Professor David Stronach, perhaps the world's leading expert on Cyrus the Great, sums up Cyrus in a single sentence.
For the first time, on a very wide scale, Cyrus used great force to protect, not degrade, the human condition.
Western civilization was founded not on Judeo-Christian values, it was founded on Iranian chivalry. The code of chivalry that the Iazyges brought to Western Europe came from the same Mithraic tradition as the code of conduct that the Persians called noble, or Arya. Mithra was once the most widely worshipped god in history, yet today few people have even heard his name.